Welcome back as we start venturing through episode 3 now in the Woodlands Eco region of the Fynbos biome. The woodlands ecosystem is a lot different to what the forest ecosystem is, whereas it is predominantly trees and has a very spatial canopy structure, allowing a lot of light to come through. In this ecosystem you can find an abundance of indigenous fruit and also some wild grasses that obviously tend to grow where the sunlight patches are. Various species of mushrooms can be found here, but there's a more diversity of mushrooms and fruit and fauna and flora that we'll find within the forest ecosystem. That's just because of the bioclimate that's involved with that. It's a more rich environment for them to thrive and a much better place for them to live. In this ecosystem as well, you look at the different types of uses of these trees. So it's not a matter of what we're going to eat, it's about all the different types of uses. So you'll find various species where we can tap sap, be able to extract that sap from it and use that sap in a cooking process, or be able to use that bark with a unique flavor profile in order to smoke foods. Another thing we can look at as well and also explore, which is also within this woodlands ecosystem and also in the forest ecosystem, is different types of edible cambrians. And the edible cambrian is obviously the layer just after the bark and you peel that off. You know, some of them are very, very nice to eat. Within this ecosystem, you'll also find a lot of trees that are very bad for this ecosystem, such as the blue gum, which is a great water sucker. But also within this ecosystem, I have a couple of indigenous trees I want to show you. This is a herb. The minute I smelt it, I started using it within the kitchen as what I call the wild rosemary. The wild rosemary itself is something that has a lot stronger flavor profile than your commercial rosemary that you would find normally in your gardens. Some very interesting things about this plant. Obviously, it differs from growing on the coastal region versus the inland drier regions, and it's unique within itself, which all the leaves are very hairy, and those hairs allow for it to capture the moisture, to capture the nutrients from the air. So it's a good foliar feeder. That helps it obviously survive. During your winter months, it gets full of these little white flowers and then develops into these cotton balls, and is always commonly known as the Cape cotton bush. It's a very pretty thing to see. One thing I really like about this plant is how it pairs itself with lamb, and especially your Karoo lamb and the lamb we get down the Overberg. The lamb that comes from the Overberg feeds off all the natural wild vegetation that comes off the Renosterveld, which is actually beautiful. It gives the meat such a beautiful sweet flavor. It's a really great thing to add to your lamb dishes. This plant itself, also the soil type that it grows in is generally in clay or granite soils. So it's a strong survivor. It has a very strong taproot system. It really gets down to obviously find the nutrients from the underlying water sources. Let us be truth or tale, but they say that if you take this and you boil this with water and you apply it to your hair, it inspires obviously hair growth. Maybe it's obviously something that I need, but yeah, a plant that's obviously very high in terpenes and has a great aroma, so it's a great thing to have in your garden. The bees love it with the flowers themselves, and the flowers are very sweet when you get them when they first come into bloom. Obviously this stage of the plant's life now, it's gone into the cotton ball stage, and as generally this is where it's dispersing its seed to keep on growing. So we can expect a lot more for the wild rosemary obviously growing within this area. So right guys, I wanted to introduce you to a tree here, and this is something that everyone always gets mistaken with our indigenous waterberry, but this is what they call the Australian brush-tick berry. The berry within itself is a lot different to our waterberry, whereas the bottom of the base is basically round on our waterberry, and this one is divided into 4 sections. So it's easy to distinguish. Also the shape of the berry is completely different to the waterberry. This is more of a bell shape as opposed to our waterberry being ellipse, and the taste and the flavor is completely different as well. The juice of this berry is very much like grape juice, where it contains tartaric acid, cream of tartar, sugar and red fruit colouring. When this berry is fermented, the juice behind obviously it has the same flavour profiles and aromas as what obviously grapes would produce when they're making wine. Something very interesting about this thing, so it's in a baking additive as well. If you're looking for a cream of tartar replacement, you can use a tartaric acid replacement. You can use this for red colouring as well. You can extract the colouring as well and use that colouring in your cooking. The reason that this species is problematic within the ecosystem with our indigenous species is it draws up all the water, very much like the blue gum, very water hungry. Our indigenous species are dependent on underground water systems, and with their spreading roots, they tend to pull up all the water around, making it very hard for the indigenous species to survive. Definitely look at obviously harvesting all these invasive berries as well, so the minute they drop into the ground, the seeds start spreading. So by us obviously harvesting this fruit, utilizing this fruit and just getting rid of this fruit properly, there's no chance of it getting dispersed to the new trees growing. So we start helping the impact of the ecosystem. These plants as well, they have some very beautiful little flowers that they developed as well. It's like little pin cushions, very lovely, have a sweet scent, and there's always a lot of bees. One thing I've noticed when bees are obviously trying to get all the nectar out of here so they can obviously go take back and make honey, is they become very aggressive, which shows me there's obviously a high sap content within these flowers. One thing you'll notice is about obviously trees growing within the woodlands, they don't grow as high in the forest because there's a lot more space. And I was very surprised to actually find this tree growing there. And it just shows that a seed has been taken by a bird, has been dropped off, and over the years this tree has just grown and established itself. But generally trees within a woodlands ecosystem grow a lot shorter, a little bit wider, and so you look at a tree between 3 and 7 meters high. A South African indigenous species that is well distributed throughout South Africa as part of the Canthium family. This one in particular is known as the Cape Date or turkeyberry or the Gewone Bokdrol. The reason they call it those things, firstly for the turkeyberry, how that name came about. So when the fruit drops down to the floor, ground fowls such as turkeys, partridges, pheasants tend to take a liking to the berry and eat that berry. And the Gewone Bokdrol, if you look at a South African farmer with their game farms as well, generally in patches, antelopes would obviously put their markings down there and obviously leave their bokdrol behind there, which is their droppings. So underneath this tree, when all the fruit is ripe, it drops down to the floor. You look down, this looks like bokdrol. Cape Date fruit to me is a lovely snack. You can eat it when it's just ripened, when it just changes its tone from green to that dark brown color. The outer skin, when the berries are dried, and they're generally dry on the vine with the ones that don't fall on the floor. But when you eat it, it resembles like strawberry fruit roll and guava fruit roll. It's got that lovely sweet fruity flavor that obviously generates as it ripens up. Berry within itself has 2 stones inside of it, and what you need to do if you want to extract that fruit, obviously when it's just ripened and still nice and soft and juicy, is you cook it down there and then you put it through to a sieve and you work it through that way to get it extracted away from the seeds. And then you take that pulp, you can ferment that pulp, you can make a jam, you can make a basting, a glaze, whatever you'd like to do with that as well. But it's a lovely unique flavor profile. As I mentioned earlier, with trees growing within woodlands ecosystems, they generally grow a lot lower, so it's easier to harvest the fruit that way. So if you're looking for species like that, look within the woodlands, riverines and stuff like that before you enter into the forest ecosystems. The wood from this tree it's a very hard wood, so in the old days they used to use them to make wagons and furniture. This is a plant that actually comes from my hometown, and it's actually named after my hometown or the area that it's from, and it's called the wild plum, also known as the sierwesi. The way that I was introduced to this plant as a young kid growing up is when I was going downhill on a skateboard and one of the pips got underneath my wheel. I looked up, I found the tree. Easy to distinguish those trees, number 1 by the fruits, and number 2 is by the sickle shape at the end of the branches where the fruit clusters obviously build up. The fruit in itself can be extracted to make rosé wine, marmalades, fruit rolls and jams. Very, very delicious, but also very sour. In the berry itself, it contains a very large stone, so the fruit around it is easy to be extracted by peeling the skin off, and it easily comes off from the layers when you start from the top and then you start pulling down to reveal the fruit. Also on these trees you generally find a lot of ants in them as well. So when you harvest your fruit, just make sure that they're not infested with ants or any insects. Look at the fruit before you harvest it as well, and pick it when it's bright red and it's the right time to eat. As they age, the fruit inside kind of dries up and becomes a bit of like a pulp. Not very nice to eat, it's very corky. When we're looking at woodlands ecosystems, this is one tree that's very common in coastal woodlands. So if you're looking to find it, generally it goes from Eastern Cape northwards upwards where it grows, but there's nationwide distribution of this tree. The nice thing about this tree is all the fruits don't ripen at the same time, so it gives you a prolonged harvest of this fruit from this tree. Okay, so I'm in a very historical place today, a little place called Genadendal, and surrounded by me are probably oaks 300 to 400 years old, one of the first settlements for the Cape Dutch settlers. But within this ecosystem that lives around here, you know, there's a wild abundance of mushrooms. So obviously this time of the year, I was very lucky enough to find some beautiful wood blewits that were growing underneath the white oak leaves. Such a delicious tasty mushroom. So if you're ever out in the wild and you see one of these guys, just know you hit the jackpot. Enjoy. Wood blewits are saprophytes, so they live off the dead organic matter that's lying on the floor that falls from the trees. So how do we identify these wood blewit mushrooms? So generally wood blewit mushrooms have a smooth purple cap and brown with age. But sometimes can be mistaken for Cortinara species, which is called the violet web cap. These generally have dark violet to blue cap and covered in fine downing scales. Very easy to distinguish, it is very dark. When you harvest this mushroom as well, it's always a good idea to smell the mushroom, and this mushroom should have a floral bouquet as opposed to its other edible friends that live in the forest with it in the woodlands, which have those earthy tones such as porcinis and truffles. The nice thing about wood blewit mushrooms is they generally grow together in clumps, which makes harvesting very easy. If you find one clump, you're going to find more, so you just got to look around. But follow the indicators of obviously looking for wood blewit mushrooms. One important thing obviously when harvesting wood blewit mushrooms is that they're prone to infestation by bugs. So even though the mushroom might look great, it's always a good idea to take a knife and cut it down the center and to look for any infestations in the center core. The thing with wood blewit mushrooms, you need to cook these mushrooms because they contain a sugar called thallose, which is edible for most people but undigestible for some people. So some people have a reaction to indigestion by eating them. These are absolutely stunning mushrooms, a flavor profile, pan fried with a little bit of garlic, a little bit of confetti bush, you know, keeping it an indigenous. Lovely complement to offer to any dish for breakfast or for lunch or for dinner, but a highly prized mushroom. This process of foraging and looking at these mushrooms now, it's not a matter of harvesting them at this stage, it's a matter of us learning about identifying them, looking at the ecosystem they're living in, understanding their purpose within a symbiotic relationship with this ecosystem, and marking this for next season. As you know, that's a part of the learning process. It's about understanding the species, learning about the species, knowing where they're growing. So when we look at mushrooms, you also got to realize that there's edible mushrooms and there's very medicinal mushrooms, and to me this is the king of the medicinals. This is what they call the reishi mushrooms. In China it's called lingzhu, and in Japan it's known as reishi or mataka. This mushroom's medicinal properties, you know, it provides anti-fatigue, anti-stress, it's great for your immune system. This mushroom itself is a great source of antioxidants, so very good for your body. There's an ancient coffee brew that they call Reishi coffee, and the way that they prepare it, they take something like chicory root and they roast that down and grind it. Then they take the reishi, they dry that, they grind it and they brew it together as a coffee brew. It's like an instant boost, your body feels great, you've got so much energy, but also with that as well, it balances, it resets you. So your internal system as well is benefiting from it as well by putting the right bacteria and nutrients back within your body. You know, and if you start looking about your internal properties and how it benefits you through the things that you could be using, you know, you can start taking away all those pharmaceutical things and looking at natural medicines. Something that's really believed by the Chinese and the Japanese, that this mushroom has a reverse process on aging. So by using it in the correct doses as well, you can reverse that aging process that is said to believe. The mushroom generally grows off the root systems of hardwood trees, and this one specifically is growing off a white oak tree. And it takes generally about 6 months for it to complete its fruiting process, so it does take time. So the nice thing as well, when you've got your collection of your edibles that you know where to go, and you've got your collection of medicinals where to go, you know, you start plotting those GPS coordinates and you keep coming back to those spots. Now, these medicinal mushrooms provide you with a free form of medicine, and the wild edibles provide you with a free source of food. One thing these mushrooms also need as well, which this ground cover helps with, is a high humidity environment as well, and with the decomposing matter as well as a lot of moisture that's breaking down. With the early mornings, it just gives it enough humidity throughout the day to obviously survive. But the deeper you go, you find these within the forest as well as you find them within the woodlands. So as I'm wandering through the woodlands ecosystem, in the light patches you'll find certain species of grasses, some invasive species of grasses. So I thought I'd just dig up this guy and just to give you a bit of an overview about it, and it's a grass that we can actually come back to later in another series. This is what they call the earth almond, also known as a tiger nut, chafa and yellow nutsedge. This plant within itself is one of the oldest cultivated plants in Egypt and was a vital food source for them. So because we're a bit early now, there's no seed, but just to tell you a bit about the seed or the nut on it as well. It's very similar to what almond is. The milk you can extract from is very high in protein. So when you harvest this plant, and obviously you want to keep the nut for a longer storage period, you would take the nut and you would obviously dry it in the sun for up to about a period of 3 months for longer storage periods. But this nut can be eaten fresh. It can be eaten raw, it can be broken down into milk, so many different types of uses, and we should be using more of this to get rid of the species. The problem with it is as well, it seeds itself in two ways, through the seed and obviously through the root system as well. So you'll see it'll run in runners. The root system runs in a matrix, and the reason it has the name the tiger nut is the nut itself. When we look at those again, you'll see it's round, but it has a whole bunch of stripes around it, hence the name. It's called the tiger nut or the earth almond. When you're harvesting these earth almonds, you've got to dig quite deep down because the roots and the nuts and the seeds get quite deep. So the best is to take a trowel or a spade and just to loosen up around the plant and then to loosen that source. Many countries in Africa also make a fermented malt drink out of this because it's a very high source in protein for them, so very nutritional for local communities. This is generally a crop that in China and all of that you'll find within the rice paddies, and you'll find along our water systems as well, but also within the woodlands. This plant's bigger brother, and everybody will know about it, which grows along the banks of the Nile River, which is called the papyrus. And if you look at the full plant of a fully grown papyrus on the Nile River, it looks very similar to this. You know, we do have papyrus species growing along our rivers and our water systems, which are also introduced here for stabilizers. Unfortunately, the long-term thing about that, and nobody did the proper studies to see what the long-term impacts were going to be, and this has become problematic. There's a few other grasses that I'm going to get through to in another episode and teach you about it and see how we can make a difference.